Welcome to another Tech Elevator Live, everyone. My name is Dan Vega, and today is going to be a getting started with CSS. So as everyone's starting to filter in, please go ahead and let us know in the chat, where are you joining us from? What is your level of experience with CSS? And yes, sorry about the sound issue. I also want to let you know that Beth Campbell and an instructor from our Pittsburgh campus will be joining us in chat today. She will be moderating. So if you have questions, please go ahead and ask, and either her or I will try and get to those. All right, again, today is an intro to CSS. If you could, in the chat, let me know where you're coming from and where you're joining us from and what your level of experience with CSS is. Hi, Nick. Thanks for joining us today. Stephanie S. Hi, how are you? So real quick, as people are coming in here, this little pillow right here, subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll go ahead and get notified anytime we schedule more live events or anytime we post a video. So please do us a favor and subscribe there. Hi, Beth. How are you? Stephanie, hi. Very new with some exposure to coding, rather rudimentary. I have zero experience with CSS, a little with HTML. All right, that's great. Nick, Columbus, Ohio, no CSS but HTML experience. Perfect. So that's exactly what we are getting into today. Christina, Columbus, Ohio, no experience. This is my first tech class. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Perez, hello. How are you doing today? So again, as there's another one, Deborah, Ohio, no experience with CSS. Cool. So we have that is definitely our target audience for today, because we are going to go over some basics of CSS. So real quick, what is Tech Elevator Live? So Tech Elevator Live is put on by Tech Elevator. Who are we? We are a full stack coding bootcamp. And it's really our mission to help students from diverse backgrounds become software developers. And we do this through a 14-week intensive boot camp where we teach you how to code and we build necessary career readiness skills and career connections to our nationally recognized pathway program. So who am I? I am a curriculum developer at Tech Elevator. And so I have a really fun job. I get to work on the materials that students go through. So it's my job to really stay up to date on what our hiring partners are looking for. It's really my job to make sure that over these 14 weeks, and our team's job actually, make sure that over these 14 weeks, you're getting everything that you really need to be successful in the workforce. So I get to work on a whole bunch of demos and documentation and exercises and tutorials. So that's who I am. That's who we are. And we're really excited to bring these Tech Elevator Lives to you, just a chance to kind of share with you what coding's like and some of the different fields that you can go into if you're interested in learning how to code. Hi from Paris, Sorry if I butchered that. From Detroit, some knowledge. That's good. All right, so I think with that, we'll kind of go ahead and get started here. We have a lot to cover today. And as always, as we get into this, if you have suggestions for future live sessions that you'd like to see, if you'd like to see us go through something, please let me know. You can see our information up this way. There it is. So techelevator.com is our website. Go ahead and check us out there. I'll have a little bit more information at the end of this as well. You can find us on our social channels. But if you want to send me an email personally, dan@techelevator.com, let me know if you have an interest in a particular topic that you'd like to see us cover, and I'd be happy to look into it for you. So quick agenda today. We are going to talk about CSS, really what it is and how it's powering the web, how it kind of makes everything that you do on the web look nice. We looked at HTML last week in our last live stream, and HTML is really just a structure to a document. It doesn't really do anything as far as creating these nice web pages that you use every single day. And the idea behind these first few sessions was to help you gain some knowledge as to what are the technologies needed to create a simple web page. So again, we walked through some HTML last week. We took just a little dive into CSS, but today I want to dive further into that because it's really important when it comes to building web pages. So we're going to do a quick recap of some HTML stuff that I think is important, and then we're going to get into kind of the fundamentals of CSS. You don't need anything installed on your computer. We'll talk more about that in a second. But that's what we're going to get into today. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen. So I just want to talk a little bit about CSS. So some of the web pages that you visit every single day, the reason that they look so nice is because of CSS. So here I am looking at Amazon, and we can see these nice images. We can see everything's kind of laid out in a particular order. You see, I have a daughter, so she likes a lot of books here. So we've been buying a lot of books for her. And you can just see like everything looks like really nice. Again, another website you might visit is apple.com. You can see these big, beautiful images, these typography. Just everything looks really crisp and clear. And this really has nothing to do with HTML. This is the images, the CSS that is styling all this together. And another website that you might see is Microsoft, and you have this beautiful navigation bar up here. And what I want to do is just show you a little experiment. So I have this Chrome plugin installed in my browser that's basically going to disable CSS. So if we come in here and we say, hey, I want you to go ahead and turn CSS off. And what I want to do here is just refresh this page. And let's see if that was not turned off. There we go. So here's what you get without CSS. You get just a whole bunch of plain text. So we have this bar up here. We have some text. We have a whole bunch of more text, a bunch of links, and then just a bunch of images and links to other things, right? Doesn't look real good, does it? This is a structure of our document using HTML. So HTML gives us the ability to build a web page. CSS gives us the ability to style a web page. Similarly, if we went over to apple.com and refresh that, you can see again, there's just a bunch of lists and links and paragraphs and headings, all the things that we kind of talked about last week. Similarly, Microsoft, we used to have this nice list up here, this nice navigation bar. And this just turns into a whole bunch of buttons and lists and images. So just the little point of that little experiment there was just to show you how important CSS is to building web pages. So there are some default styles that come packaged with your browser that kind of make lists look a little bit nice, but it's really the power of CSS that enables us to style these web pages and make them look nice. So that's that. Today we're going to be using something called CodePen. We did this last week as well. So codepen.io. If you weren't able to join us last week, no big deal. Head over to codepen.io. You can start a free account. We have no affiliation with them, just a really great resource on the web. And what it allows you to do is build HTML and CSS without having anything installed locally on your machine. Now, with that said, our next live stream is set up already, scheduled for next Thursday at 11 a.m. And what we're going to be doing in that session is really setting up your local machine. So what are the tools that you need to develop a website on your local computer? What if you don't want to use CodePen? What if you want to start to build your own web page locally and then push it up to some hosting so other people can see it? We're going to dive into that next week. But what I want to do is just come back to my local machine for a second here. And I'm going to go into what we're going to cover next week, which is Visual Studio Code. I'm going to improve that font a little. And the reason I wanted to jump into this really quick is because I want to kind of go over something we talked about last week. In CodePen, you have the ability to enter HTML and CSS. We talked about this, but the structure of a document, the structure of an HTML document looks like this. You have this head section, which controls basically some metadata and things like the title in the title bar, like in the tab, or you could add like a favicon that you might see in a tab as well. But all of the content that you see on a page happens within this body tag. And that's important because we're going to be doing some styling to the body tag today, but you can't really see that in CodePen because CodePen just gives you this nice little HTML area where you can start entering HTML, but ultimately anything you enter into that box is in between a body tag once you get to a web page. So I just wanted to kind of cover that because it is important to talk about because again, we are going to start doing some styling to our body tag. So let me know again, if you have any questions, please go ahead. Feel free to ask them. Again, our instructor Beth is with us. Thanks, Beth, for joining us. And what we're going to do is just kind of jump on in and we're going to learn some basic styles. So we'll go through and talk about how to add styles to different HTML elements. We're going to run through all of the kind of basics to CSS. There's a lot more that we can't cover in just this hour. So when we leave this today, I'll kind of let you know like what next steps are, what are some resources that you can learn on your own. And we'll try and wrap this up by putting together a little portfolio project today. So just checking the chat here, making sure there's no questions, and we'll go ahead and get started. So let me start with comments. So one thing we didn't talk about last week was comments in HTML. You can have comments in CSS. And the way a comment is created is by using this / and a star. And then whatever text you want to type. So this is a comment. And comments end with a star and a / in CSS. And comments are a way for us to just leave little notes to ourselves or to another developer. You don't want to get you don't want to have too many comments in here. They need to like be short and sweet and make sure they're there for a reason. But comments are a way to go ahead and add some notes in your code, if you will. So what I want to do now is go ahead and add some HTML over here in my page. So I'm going to start with an H1 tag. So that's a heading 1. And I'm just going to say this is my page title. So if you weren't with us last week, as we go ahead and type in the HTML, as we type in the CSS here in CodePen, the information shows up here below. And if you want to go ahead and follow along with me, I'll paste this link in the chat. And so here is an H1 tag. Let's go ahead and throw 3 paragraphs in here. I'm just going to use a quick shortcut with some dummy text that allows us to have 3 paragraphs. So we have a page title and 3 paragraphs. So the first thing I want to talk about today is what we call a selector. So I'm going to put this in my notes here, selector, and we are going to be talking about element selectors to be specific. So what we want to do is when we write our CSS, we start with a selector. We want to target something in our HTML, right? So the first thing that I'm going to target is that body tag. So we have that body tag, and inside that body tag, that we are saying like, hey, this is the start of our CSS rules. This is our selector. We are targeting the HTML tag body. And then inside of here is where all of our different style declarations are going to go. And style declarations in CSS are made up of two sides. On the left side, we have a property, a colon, and then a value, and then a semicolon. So whenever you see CSS, you're going to see a property on the left, a value on the right, and that is a colon in between those two, and a semicolon basically ends it so that you can go down to the next line and say, let's declare a new style declaration. And so there are a ton of style declarations that we can go ahead and create in here, and that will allow us to change the style of our web page. So let's just go ahead and leave that there for now. So if we wanted to target another element on the page, say our heading 1, we can start with an H1 and then this open curly bracket and end curly bracket. And a convention is usually to put those on a new line and then our style declarations in between. So that's how we create a selector. Now what we want to do is talk about some things that we can go ahead and change. And what I'm going to do is actually bump this font up. Let me know if that font size is okay and if you guys can see everything okay. And what I'm going to do now is talk about fonts. So fonts are a fun thing. So the default font for my browser right now, which is Chrome, is Times New Roman. And I think I'd like to go ahead and change that. That's one thing that I can see right off the bat that I'd like to improve on. So what I can do is actually target the body. So again, we have our body selector. We want to say anything that happens in the body, which we know now is all of the HTML that we're entering here on the left, is going to have these following rules. So one of the properties that we can change is font family. So again, our property, colon, and then the value is going to go on the right. So I just want to make a quick note here. Actually, I'll make that in a second. But we have our font family, and then we're going to give it a value. So I'm going to put in something here, and we'll talk about it. Oops, Helvetica, if I could spell, Sans-Serif. So that is the property font family. The value is Arial, Helvetica, Sans-Serif. And if you saw, the text changed a little. So if I go ahead and comment that out, and then you see it change back to the default Times New Roman. And if I bring that back, you can see that that font changes. And I like this change already. This is a good start to kind of styling our web page. So what is Arial, Helvetica? Oh, I didn't spell sans-serif right. That might help as well. So we're not going to get too far into typography here, but this is really the start of like styling our web page, right? There are a few types of different fonts. So there are very few fonts that you can use that are really what we consider web safe. And these are fonts that are installed on everybody's computer. So that default that I had, Times New Roman, Times, those things are installed on everybody's computer. So are Arial, Helvetica, and another one I believe is Courier, which is monospaced. So these are installed on everybody's computer. So there are very few fonts that you have access to that everyone has. Because if you try to display a font that somebody doesn't have on their computer, it's not going to work. Now, there are options, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is one thing that I just did. Now, the three values here are basically saying, if the user has Arial on their machine, please go ahead and use that. I want to use a fallback of Helvetica. If they have that, go ahead and load that. Finally, any generic sans-serif will do. And so what we're talking about here is sans-serif versus serif, because Times New Roman is a serif font, Arial is a sans-serif. And all that means is if I go ahead and bump this up a little bit more, and I take this off, see these little curly cues? There's like on the ends, and the Q and the L, those little curlies those are basically a serif. And if we put this back and we go to sans-serif, now you don't see those anymore. So really, this is just a preference. I mean, whatever you want to have on your web page is great, but I wanted to point that out. So let's go ahead and put a comment there. And we're just going to say serif is curly, sans-serif is no curly. Just so you have that comment if you're curious about that later. So that's one way that we can go ahead and change the font. Again, as I said, there aren't a ton of fonts that you have access to, but there are some really great resources to be able to use a web font. And now a web font is a way that we can include a font on our web page so that when the user visits our page, that font is now available to them. One of the most popular out there is Google Fonts. So if we go to Google Fonts and we check this out, you can go view a whole list of some really great fonts out there. And you can like type something in and get a preview of what it might look like. And so these are some fonts that you can use. And here in CodePen, we actually have a few of these available. So if we go into assets and we go to fonts and we go, let's say we want to use Roboto. If we just go ahead and copy the font family, come back in here, and I'm going to change the font family for the body to Roboto Sans-Serif. And as you can see, the font went ahead and changed. I happen to like a Roboto a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. So that's a little bit about default fonts and some other fonts that you can go ahead, but just that little change there that we made to the body allows us to go ahead and change the fonts for our entire web page. Now, we did this at the body level. We're basically saying that, hey, anything that falls under body, I want you to have this new font family of Roboto. You can also get more specific. You can say, hey, everything in the body is fine, but I want something different for my H1s. For my H1s, I want that Arial, oops, I guess I copied that wrong, sorry. I want Arial Helvetica Sans-Serif for just the H1s. So now you see the H1 is a little bit different than the rest of the text on our web page. And so again, this is how we're kind of targeting different elements on our web page. Here we're using the body tag. Here we're using the H1 tag. So we're saying, hey, just the H1 element, I want you to go ahead and change the font for. So again, all of these things are called selectors. There's a bunch of different selectors. We're going to talk about a few today. But a selector is just a way to target something specifically. And in this case, it's an element selector because we're targeting the body element. We're targeting the heading 1 element and so on. So that's one thing we can change when it comes to fonts. There are a few other things that we can change about fonts. Maybe we want to change the font size. So let's go ahead and what if I wanted to change the font size for just my paragraphs? Does anyone in the chat know what element selector I would use to go ahead and target just my paragraphs? Give you guys a second. So before I targeted the body and the H1, how can I target just the paragraph elements? All right, I'm going to go ahead and use a P tag. So here I'm using a P element selector, and I'm saying, hey, just the paragraphs I want to change this stuff for. So now that I have my element selector here, I'm going to go ahead and enter some style declarations. So we looked at font family. Another one that we can use is font size. So we're going to talk a little bit about measurement here, but I don't want to get too far into it. So we want to express some way that we can say, yes, I see a few people in the chat saying P. Sorry, I think my chat's a little bit behind. by adding p tag and selectors. Great. So what I want to change is the font size, and I need to give it a specific size, right? So one way that you'll see this expressed is by pixels, px. So you could come in here and say, I want my paragraph text to be really large and I want it to be 48 pixels. So if you see 48 pixels, you see that text gets really, really big. That may not be a great idea for our paragraph tags, but we're just using this as a demonstration. So another way that you're going to see sizes in the browser represented is by something called a rem. So one rem is going to be our default. And the way a rem works is it calculates based off the default browser font size, which in our case is going to be 16 pixels. So if we were to go ahead and change this to 2 rem, it's basically saying this is going to be a 32 pixel font size. And you can go anywhere in between. So if I just wanted to say it was 1.1, maybe 1.3 gives us a little bit bigger text, that looks a lot better to me. And so the reason that we do this is there are a couple different reasons. As we start to scale down to different devices, this now lets the browser do some math and figure out what that particular size should be, because the default font size may be smaller on a different device. And again, it really just allows us to scale as we look at this on different devices. And there are some options in our browser that let us control this stuff for different form factors. So I'll just leave it at that, but know that 1 rem is basically the default browser, which is 16 pixels, so you can kind of adjust from there. You'll see it in both rems, ems, and even pixels. So that's another thing that we can change. Something else we could change about one of our fonts is the color. We're going to talk about color in a second though, so I'm going to skip that. What we can also do is go ahead and target, or we can change the font style. So maybe we wanted to change the font style of all of our paragraph to be italics. Let's go ahead and save, and now you see all of our paragraphs are using a hey all, you might be a few seconds behind the live broadcast. I buffered a bit for a few. If you click on the live down on the playback bar, it will catch you up. Good tip, Beth. Sorry if we're lagging behind a little bit. Okay, so we have we've added that style, the font style, to be able to change the style of our text. Something else we could do is we can align our text. So right now we are left aligned. What if we wanted to align all of our paragraph tags to be in the center of the page? So we can say, I want to text align this in the center. And now all of our text is centered in the page. So those are a few things that we can do with the P tag there. I'm going to put that back actually. Actually, I don't mind the font size, so I'm going to keep that and we'll comment those out. So that's a little bit what we can do with fonts in the browser. So that's really a good starting point to kind of cleaning up your web page and adding a little style of your own. Next, let's talk about colors. What if I wanted to change the color of some of the text, or say the background of my entire page? So let's start there. What if I wanted to change the background? So let's go ahead and say background color. That is the property that we're going to change. And then we need to give it a value. So there are a couple different ways that we can express colors as our values. We can give it just a literal name. So we can say something like green or purple, or something really bright like hot pink. So if we go ahead and change that to hot pink, you can see our background is now a hot pink. So that is one way that we can express colors. Another way that we can do it is by what's called a hex value. And I'm going to open up a page here, and this might be a good page to bookmark, and I'll try and get in the description below as well. So this page goes into a little bit more detail about colors and how you can use them on the web. If you go down here though, there's this nice list. So there's all these different colors. So if you wanted to use like black, you could say black. If you wanted to use white, if you wanted to use red, purple, and so on. Now, I don't remember all these numbers or all these keywords for all of these different colors, but this is a list that you can go through. And then there's also a corresponding RGB hex value. So if we go down and look for hot pink, you can see that we can also express hot pink using this hex value of FF69B4. So really this is an RGB value. So the first two are the red, the second two are the green, and the second two are the blue. Now again, I don't remember all of these. I know ones like black and white and some grays that I use a lot. And it's just because I use them a lot. But you'll start to remember these as you go. And as we look at next week, when we get into something like Visual Studio Code and IDE on your local computer, these are going to help you like figure out those colors. So you could type in a purple and then kind of mess with the shade of it if you want to get it to a specific one. So here what I'm doing is just copying this value, this DC, DC, DC. I'm going to head back over to CodePen, and instead of expressing it by a name of hot pink, I'm going to go ahead and use that hex value. And the only reason I'm showing you that is because you're probably going to come across this when you're looking at other CSS. You're going to see this color represented as a hex value. So now what we can do is we can change background colors. So I'm going to go back to my hot pink. We can also change the color of text. So I don't like this black on top of the hot pink. I'm going to change the color to something like white. And that's a little bit more bright in my face. Now, something you wouldn't want to do is come in here and change this to hot pink as well, because now we can't see the color, or we can't see the fonts because they're actually the same color as our background. So that's just something to be careful of as well. So color is the attribute of the font that you're changing, and then the background dash color is the property of the background color. So again, we have our properties on the left, we have our values on the right. Any questions with fonts or colors? Okay, so we've talked about two common things that you'd want to change on a page, which are fonts and colors. Before we jump into a few more of the common properties, though, I want to talk a little bit more about these selectors that we're working with. There are times when you will not want everything on the page to look the same. So maybe we don't want all of our headings to be a certain color, or maybe we want one of our paragraphs down here to be a different color or have some different properties to them. And so this is where using something like a CSS class will come into play. So right now we have this color white for everything in the body. That means our H1, that means our paragraph tags, everything is going to have a color of white. But what we can do is actually come in here and create a class that says, hey, I want to specifically target this class and I want to change the properties of that class. So all we do is come into our HTML tag, and as we learned about last week, we can add attributes to our tags. So one attribute we can add is class. So we're going to say class, and we'll just call this let's say, what's a good color that we can, probably not yellow. Let's try like a, something really awful. Let's just try like green text. So we're going to have a class called green text, and this green text class is now allowing us, it's going to now allow us to target just that third paragraph. Oh, real quick. So I did have a question in here. Dan, why are we giving 3 values in the font family and not just 1 value? So you actually could just leave it at 1. Oops. You could remove both of these if you wanted to, and it would use Arial. The 3 values on the fonts are always good to have, and what these are fallbacks. So if for some reason they didn't have, the user that's visiting your website didn't have Arial, it would fall back to Helvetica. And if for some reason they didn't have Helvetica, it would fall back to a generic sans-serif. So that's the reason we use 3 values there and 1 value on the rest of the properties. So back to our class. We have this class called green text, and this allows us to be a little bit more specific. So now what I can do is I can say dot green text. So the dot is saying, hey, I want to target a class now. So there's no dot on this P, this paragraph tag, because that's an element. With an element selector, you just use the element's tag name in this class. In this case, it's a paragraph. When you're targeting a class, it starts with a period and then the class name. So I'm going to say green text, and what I'm going to do is come in here and I'm going to say the color for this is going to be green. And wow, that looks really bad. So I'm actually going to come back over here and see if I could find like, oh, green yellow. That should be really bad. So again, you can do some really bad designs with CSS as well as some really good designs. So here we have this green text, and we can see that it's just targeting that 3rd paragraph. So that is a way that we can get a little bit more specific, because there may be times where you don't want all your paragraphs to look the same, or all your unordered lists, or all your headings. And this is where classes and things like ID selectors come into play. We're not going to get into all the different selectors today, but we'll start to see a few of them. So now one of the things that may come up is, well, do I have to, what happens if I define a class over here, some class, and I don't define it over here? That is perfectly valid syntax. And a lot of the times, this is what happens when you start developing websites with CSS, is you really got to be careful that the classes that you're defining, whether they're in your CSS style sheet or they're in your markup over on the HTML side, that they're definitely being used. So if this is not going to be used, you want to go ahead and get rid of this. On the flip side, you can come over here and say .sum class and define a font size of 30 pixels. And we are not using it anywhere in the markup, and that is totally fine as well. But if we're not using it in the markup, it's good not to have in our class, because these CSS classes can become a little bit out of hand if you don't take care of them. So be careful of what you're creating in here, and make sure that if you create a class, you're using it in your markup and vice versa. So that's a little bit about classes. Now, one thing we could do is we can go ahead and add this same class to the second one. And we can say, okay, I want both the 2nd and the 3rd paragraphs to have some green text. But what happens if I had a class here? Let's call this, what if I wanted the 1st and the 3rd to have some larger text? Or actually, let me just do this. What I want to get to here is, how can we, actually, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this because I don't like this green text. It's really bothering me. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And what I want to do now is I'm going to take this color off the body tag. So now, if it wasn't on the body tag and I didn't want my entire web page fonts to be a color of white, one thing I could do is I could come into this H1 and I can say, I want the color of my H1s to be white, and I want the font color for my paragraphs to be white. Okay, so that's one thing I could do. But we can also target multiple elements or multiple selectors at a time. So what I'm going to do is cut this out and cut this out. And what I can do is I can say I want all my H1 elements, and then I'm going to go ahead and add a comma and say I want all my paragraph elements. So now I'm saying both of these selectors, I'm going to target all heading ones and all paragraphs. They're all going to have the following characteristics. So I'm going to go ahead and put color white in there. And as you can see, it targets them both. So that's a way to style multiple elements with CSS. So we looked at a few different selectors. We talked about the element selector. We talked about using a class selector. We talked about the ability to target multiple classes or multiple elements on a page. I'm going to leave another link here. I'll try to get this in the description below as well, but there are a ton more selectors. As you start to see your needs go up as far as designing your web pages, there might be other ways to target different things on your web page. So here's a list of all these different types of selectors that you can create. Again, this is probably a little bit advanced. We can get into this into another live session, but I just wanted to be able to go ahead and share that with you. So, and really the reason that I wanted to bring that up too is because when setting all these rules up, it's important to understand that when multiple rules apply to a single element, the browser has some special rules to figure out which styles win, right? These rules are called specificity, and we can read a little bit more of that in the link that I am going to add to the description. So another thing I want to talk about before we get into a little bit more how to style stuff is CSS. So what does CSS stand for? It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And the first word in there is cascade, and it's really important to understand. So it's important to know that the browser loads rules in the order that it sees them. This means that a rule that is loaded last takes precedent over a rule that is loaded earlier. And so the later style overrides earlier style, and this is called cascading. So just a simple example of this. Here in the, let's just say here in our paragraph, let me go ahead and change this. Let's say here I said color was white for our paragraphs. And then I had a bunch of more styles, and I forgot that I actually had a paragraph style, and I came down here and I said color was yellow green. This is coming later. This is our selector for paragraphs. We are declaring a property of color and a value of yellow green, but this is later on. And again, we talked about cascade. The browser has some rules on which one wins. And as far as where it's declared, this one's declared later, and so this one is going to win. So if we copy this and come back up and put this below this, or above that, we can see that the color white wins. So again, this is the cascade part of cascading style sheets, or CSS. So just important to note, there are some rules on the way the browser kind of figures these things out. So that's our cascade. So now what I want to do is just go through some more different properties that you might run into as you're styling up your web page. And I will leave a reference here. Let me go ahead and drop this one in the chat, and we'll talk about this one because you saw font family, you saw font size, you started to see all these different properties that I've been declaring. You're not going to remember all of these, but as you start to work with CSS more and more, you will start to remember some of the more common ones. But as you can see down here, there's a keyword index, and there are a ton of different things that you can use to style your web page. Now, don't let this list kind of scare you, because again, there are a handful that I use every day. There are a bunch of them that can be shortened into like single statements. We call it CSS shorthand. And so things like all of these background things are just to do with a background. So here's an exhaustive list, but this is a good reference point if you ever want to find out what are the different things that we can target. So one of the things that we can do is let's go ahead and add a border to our H1. So a border allows us to go ahead and add some type of border around our element. So if I wanted to, I could say I want a border of 10 pixels, solid, and we'll go ahead and have this use the color white. So you can see that adds a border around our element. There are also different values for border. We can go ahead and say that we want a dotted border, or I think slash is one of them. So this is just a way that you can come in and add a border to any element. So right now we're just targeting the H1. If we want to go ahead and knock that down a little, we can also do things like specify which area of the border we want. So right now a border is going to give us a top, a right, a bottom, and a left. We could just say, hey, I just want a border on the bottom. So that gives us a nice border on our web page or on our H1 element. So another thing that comes into play when we talk about borders, there's this thing called the box model, which we're not going to get into today. But part of the box model, everything in a lot of these elements that we're working with have a few properties that we kind of consolidate into what's called a box model. And those are margin, border, and padding. So one thing I want to look at here is if we go back up to body, you can see that there's actually a little bit of a margin here on the left and a little bit of a margin on the top, a little bit more. But that comes in because of both the H1 and the body. But you can come in here and say, I want the margin for my body to be much bigger. Let's say it was 40 pixels. You're going to see everything kind of push out. So that margin is determining how things are spaced out in the browser. So there is something called margin. There is something called padding, and they're both a little bit different. And so one way that we can look at this is if we look at our H1 again, let's put our 10 pixel solid border on here. And if we go ahead and add a margin of top to our H1 element, and we'll say 20 pixels here, you're going to see it move down. Oops. Oh, nope, sorry. I wanted to put some padding on here. So if you go ahead and add some padding, you'll see that it moves down from the border. So the padding is what's actually being considered inside the element itself. The margin is outside of the element itself. So understanding margin, padding, and borders, and they all kind of get wrapped up into this thing called the box model, is something that we can definitely dive into further in another session because there is a lot that goes into it. But just know that you can control margin, you can control padding and borders on any element that is considered a block level element. And so all these elements that we're talking about right here, our H1, our paragraphs, these are all block level elements. Okay, so something else that we could do, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of this and start fresh here. And what I want to do is I might want to add a background image to a page. So we talked about this last week, but one of my favorite resources out there is Unsplash. So if you head over to unsplash.com, there are a bunch of great images that you can use freely. And CodePen has this Unsplash built into it. So if we go into assets and we go to photos, we can look for a photo from Unsplash. And so let's say I wanted to, let's find a water background. So this seems like a really cool background. Let's go ahead and hit on this arrow down. And what I want to do is I want to copy as a background because this is going to copy some different CSS for us. So now what I can do is come into my body. Again, we're going to target the body, which is everything on our HTML page, the outer container. And I'm going to paste this background image property in here. So now as you'll see, oh, that's a big one. Let's go ahead and change that a little. So when you grab images off of CodePen here from Unsplash, you can grab like a very large one, or you can grab just kind of a normal one. So let's go ahead and grab the small, and let's paste that back in there. Oh, and that's too small. So now you can do things like you can have this huge background image and you can change it to repeat. So in this case, we don't actually like the fact that it repeats. We can find a big one. We can change the orientation of it. We can change where it starts, how to like basically fit within our web page. So we can use different background images and then all of the different properties that go into sizing that image to really add some background images to our web pages if we wanted to. So that's one. I also want to talk about images. Let's go ahead and drop just a regular image in here. So say I had a page. So let's start with an H1. So we have a heading 1, and we'll say this is my page. And let's say I had an image that I wanted to add to this. Let's go ahead and find an image on Unsplash again. Let's say programmer. All right, I like this. Let's go ahead and grab this one. So we're going to grab the image as a full. So it's going to give us a really big image. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in there, and you're going to see this very large image show up at some point. So as you can see as I scroll, again, Unsplash is really great because you get these high resolution images. So now what we can do is we can come in our HTML and we can target that image and add some styles to it. So what if I wanted to make that image a lot smaller? I'm going to start with the image element selector by using img and then our 2 curly brackets. And now one of the things I can target on this image is the width property. So I'm going to say width, and then I'm going to give it a size. So in this case, you could say pixels. We talked about rems earlier. You can also use percentages. So maybe I want this to take up 25% of the page. So now you can see that image got a lot smaller. Now, I also would like some nice rounded corners on this image. So I can come in and I can give it another property, which is border radius. And I'm going to give that a value of 20 pixels. Now you can see I get these nice little rounded corners on my image. So again, building web pages is all about understanding the different properties that you can use within CSS, understanding how to target different elements, classes on a page, and then just applying a bunch of these different styles to them. So that's one thing I can do. Another thing I might do is I might have some text down here. So let's go ahead and create 3 paragraphs. So again, I'm just going to use a shortcut to get us some dummy text. And once I do that, I have my heading 1, I have my image, and then I have all of this text here. And what if I wanted this image to either be on the left side or the right side of the text? So again, we have targeted this image already. What I can say is I want this image to go ahead and float to the right of anything that comes after it. So basically I'm saying this image is going to float to the right, which allows our paragraphs to then kind of move up. So that's something else that we can do with images. Now, something we're not going to get into today is layouts. So CSS layouts, there's a whole bunch that goes into laying out different items on your page. And there have been some really great advancements over the last, like, say 5 years in the form of Flexbox and CSS Grid, which really allow us to get a lot of control over how we lay things on our page. Again, we're not going to go into that today, but Something else we can do. Let's say that we had some links on our page. I'm going to go ahead and add some links. So I have a link that goes nowhere. This is called link 1. And let's go ahead and add 2 more. So we can go ahead and target our links. So what if I wanted to change, let's say, the font size of all the links on our page? Does anybody know what selector we would use to go ahead and target those links? All right, I think we might be a little bit behind on the broadcast, so I'm just going to go ahead and plop that in, but we're going to use the A selector. So, oh, somebody got that in there. Thanks, Joseph. So we are targeting the anchor tag by using the A selector. So now in here, we can say, I want you to go ahead and bump this font size up. We learned about sizes earlier. So I'm going to use a rem here. I'm going to say 1.4 rem, and we'll just see what it looks like. And that looks better. Some of this, actually a lot of this, when it comes to styling web pages, is a lot of tinkering. Like, I don't know that 1.4 was going to look good, but you know, I play with it. You can play with those values and see what works for you. So one thing I also want to do is I want to take that little underline off of it. I don't want that on there. I only want that when I hover over a particular link. So another property that we can use is called text decoration. And I'm going to say none. So I don't want any underlines on that. So far that looks pretty good. But if I go ahead and go into the HTML here and I hover over this particular links, I don't see any visual indication that lets me know that like I'm actually hovering over one of those links. So we're going to introduce a new selector here called a pseudo selector. And a pseudo selector allows us to target a specific state. So in this case, I want to target the hover state. So I can say when I hover over a link, I want you to go ahead and apply these styles. So maybe we want to give it a color of hot pink. And we need a semicolon at the end there. And I also want to go ahead and add that underline back into our anchor tag. So now if I hover over this, you see I get that hot pink color and I get that text decoration. Something else you may do, something else you may come across is the ability to style lists. So if I go ahead and add a list in here, I'm going to go ahead and take those off for a second. So here I have a list. A lot of different navigation items on web pages are really just unordered lists at the end of the day. And so you'll see like if there's a header up top, that's really just an unordered list that is used to style a particular, with a bunch of CSS styles that makes it look like that. So we can come in here and start to do some things with our lists. So one thing that I noticed right away is that I don't like how close they are to each other. So maybe I come in here and I target just the list item. So I have ULs and I have LIs. If I target just the list item, I can say that I want to go ahead and add some margin to the bottom of our list item, and I want that margin to be 1.4 rem. And you can see now I get a little bit of space. That's probably too much. That looks a little bit better. You can also change the type of bullets that you're using there. So if I wanted to, I could come in here and say the list style type is a square. And you can see the list style type here is a square now. So there are a bunch of different things that you can do with lists. You can also notice here that maybe we can change this to none. Maybe we don't want an actual bullet. The unordered list itself, we can go ahead and let's go ahead and put a border around this real quick. And I'm just showing this off to show the fact that, like, here we have this border. You can see there doesn't look to be a lot of margin at the top. The bottom is actually coming from this list item, but we can see that there's some space in between the left side. And what that's coming from is really the padding on the unordered list itself. So we can always come in here to our UL, and I just know from experience that I like to go ahead and reset these. And I can say that we're going to go ahead and set those to 0. So now we get no actual margin on our unordered list. So using that little border trick around an element really helps you diagnose some problems. And even someone who's been doing this for 20 years uses that often. So you'll definitely see that when it comes to margin and padding. So what if we wanted to go ahead, so we can go ahead and style these links further if we wanted to. Again, if we had some more time, we can actually turn this into, say, like a navigation bar. So there are some things that you can do there. We are getting already over, and I had some more things that I wanted to do today. Maybe we will go ahead and leave these for a next live session. But I did have a hands-on exercise. So I want to go ahead and share that with you. Let's go ahead and close this code pen. Go to the dashboard. And I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. This is just a little CSS portfolio that I put together. It has a tag. It has, real quick, hi Dan, instead of a margin bottom, can you use padding bottom be used in an LI? In that case, yes. So there are some quirks when it comes to padding, margin, and borders. But in that case, yes, you could have used a padding bottom. Again, this really gets into the box model and like how each of our box level elements are made up of border, padding, and margin. So maybe we'll try and get to that in another live session, but yes, in that case, you could have. So I have some just plain HTML here, and then in the CSS, I have things that we can change: fonts, colors, borders, margins and paddings, images and lists. And so I want you to go ahead and take this. So I'm going to share out this pen, and I'm going to share that pen out. And what you can do is you can go ahead and fork that and save it as your own. And I'd like you to walk away from this today and just start to play with some different styles of this. You know, change the colors of the headings, change the font size of the paragraphs. Work with the basic things that we talked about today: fonts, colors, borders, margins and paddings, image widths, lists, etc. And we'll revisit this in another live session because, as I said, this was just an intro to CSS. There are a lot more things that we can cover. Things that we can cover are definitely going into the box model, understanding more about specificity, cascade, things like CSS layout, which are a whole nother animal on its own. Things like CSS properties, media queries. So we could spend a lot of time on this. I am going to leave some resources below, though. There are a couple really good resources, and two of which are Free Code Camp and the Code Academy. And really, if this session has sparked your interest in learning how to code, or maybe even landing a career in tech, I encourage you to check out the link below. So I've included a couple links. One, there's an overview of Tech Elevator along with our Aptitude Test, which is a quick way to find out if you have an interest or have what it takes for a career in coding. And we also launched a Learn to Code resources page, which was created by our expert software developers. There's video content there, tutorials, blog posts, and it will really help you out on your journey learning how to code. So a couple links below in the description. Go ahead and check those out. And I'm sorry to cut this short. I'm going to stick around now if we have some questions. Again, I wanted to cover more, but there's only so much we can do in an hour. So You mentioned you had some thoughts of what we can do in the meanwhile. In the meanwhile of what, Stephanie? Sorry. So again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them below. Be happy to answer them. Anything that you're getting stuck with while you're learning CSS, any troubles that you're running into, please feel free to let me know. If you don't have a chance to ask a question, maybe you're not joining us here on the live chat or the live stream, or maybe you just forgot about a question and you want to ask it afterwards, please feel free to send me an email, dan@techelevator.com. And again, we'd like to hear from you. What kind of sessions you'd like to see in these Learn to Code live streams. Again, this is Tech Elevator Live. Feel free to join us on Thursday, 11 a.m. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to set up your local development environment. So we've had some fun building these web pages in CodePen, which is a really great tool. And I really love it because we can do these things and kind of share them with each other. But at some point, you're going to want to write code on your local machine. And so what are the tools that you're going to need to do that with? One is Visual Studio Code. Two is a web browser like Google Chrome or Mozilla Firefox. So we'll take a look at those, how to configure them, how to use them, and how to write some HTML pages locally. Dan, how much CSS should be learned, as it is very vast to learn? Great question. So there are so many things to learn in CSS. I've been doing this 20 years. I've learned and forgotten a bunch of things because 20 years ago we were using table layouts to lay out items on a page. So this is going to be an ongoing learning thing. What I would say is learn the basics first. Don't worry about how to lay out pages. Things like Flexbox and CSS Grid are really great, and you're going to need them at some point. But before you can understand that, you really need to understand the basics. So things that we talked about today, how to create different selectors. We talked about the element selector. We saw how to target multiple things at one time. There are a lot more selectors. There are things like descendant selectors and ID selectors and combinators. Understanding selectors, specificity, cascade, those are very important concepts, core concepts to understanding CSS. Once you get those, stop and start building stuff. You can read all the documentation you want, watch all of these videos that you want, but what you really need to start do is building things. Even if it's not full web pages, even if you pick out, like, say you're on Twitter one day and you see like the left side and you see some like cool color and a list of things, take that and build that here on CodePen. Take little things and practice, because the more that you start practicing and run into a problem and realize, I don't know how to do that. How do I do that in CSS? That's where the real learning happens. Once you get really good with that, then we can start talking about layouts. So the basics, specificity, cascade, the box model, which is important in HTML and CSS. Those are the things I would really focus on first. Where to start and learn more between these? There are a lot of resources out there, and what would be a good starting place for good basic versus really going deep? I'm new to CodePen, how to save this. So let me talk about two of those. So resources on where to get started. So I think I have a two below. Free Code Camp is probably one of my favorites. I would start there. So if we head over to freecodecamp.org, and you go into Learn to Code, I think there's a responsive web design. So I would learn the basics of HTML first. Once you understand HTML, there's a CSS section. And here you can go through and understand the basics of CSS. What do I want it to control? Things like colors and fonts and spacing and sizing. So these are things that we talked today. So if you go into the first lesson here, you can see, they'll ask you some different things. All right, let's change our text colors. Let's change how we do things. So I would start with Free Code Camp. Also below in the description, we have our resource page. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. Oops. So techelevator.com, learn to code resources. So again, we've compiled a list of resources that you may be interested in. So top 5 learn to code resources curated by our experts. Go ahead and take a look at that. We do have some videos, some live events, some blog posts, etc. So go ahead and check that out as well. So I think between those, that will be a good start. And I agree. There are so many resources out there for anything you want to do these days. Again, try to limit that. Do some review, reading up on courses or different websites, and find a couple that really work instead of trying to kind of get overwhelmed by everything that's out there. Somebody had a question, how do I save a code pen? If you're logged in, there is this save button here. There's also this little pencil here. If you click on it, you can change the title of your pen, and that will go ahead and save it. So now if you go into your dashboard, under here in dashboard, you should see that pen that you went ahead and saved. All right, so again, if there are no other questions, I really want to thank you all for joining me today in this new Tech Elevator Live that we've started. We're really having a lot of fun with it. We'd like your suggestions. Please go ahead and send us an email, dan@techelevator.com. And I look forward to seeing you in the next live session. So I hope you're all staying safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks again.